This podcast is for educational and informational purposes only and does not constitute legal advice. Listeners should seek independent legal counsel for specific regulatory questions.
Yeah, that is definitely the best approach, given the sheer complexity of what we're going to cover today.
Absolutely. Because we are jumping into a deep dive today that tackles a scenario that is frankly causing a lot of sleepless nights. So I want you to picture this.
Go ahead.
It is a Tuesday morning. You have just sat down at your desk. The office is pretty quiet. You have that first cup of coffee in your hand, and you are feeling, relatively optimistic about the week.
Right, the calm before the storm.
Exactly. And then your inbox chimes. You glance over, and you are expecting, like, a routine project update or something.
But it is never a routine update, is it?
No, it is not. Instead, it is this urgent calendar invite from the chief risk officer. And the subject line just reads, "Regulatory compliance gap, immediate action required."
Oh man, your stomach just instantly drops when you see something like that.
It completely drops. So you click the meeting link, and there is this attachment. It is a 47-page report from an external audit team.
Which is never a fun read.
No. You open the PDF, you start scrolling, and almost immediately you hit this massive wall of just terrifying capitalized acronyms.
Let me guess. CSRD, DORI, CS3D.
Yes, all of them. And 6AMLD. The language is incredibly dense, but somewhere around paragraph 11, buried in all this legalistic corporate speak, you see the phrase potential personal enforcement exposure.
And that right there, that phrase alone is the ultimate blood pressure spiker for anyone sitting in a management or a board position today.
I can imagine.
Yeah, and the thing is, this is a scenario that is playing out in real time in boardrooms literally all over the world right now.
Right, because the ground underneath corporate operations has just completely shifted, hasn't it?
Oh, totally. The era where a regulatory fine was just a line item on a corporate balance sheet, that is effectively over.
And that is really the mission of our deep dive today. We have this mountain of source material detailing the new global regulatory architecture.
Specifically, the European Union's frameworks, which are just incredibly ambitious.
Highly ambitious and very overlapping. But our goal here is not just to hand you a glossary, right? We are not just decoding an alphabet soup of directives.
No, that would be incredibly boring. We are going to examine the rapidly widening chasm between what rules require on paper and what firms actually do in messy day-to-day reality.
Because that gap, that specific space between policy and practice, carries immense financial and legal costs.
And the most critical insight we found in the sources is that regulators are no longer satisfied with just punishing the abstract entity of the corporation.
Right. They are putting a target directly on the backs of individual managers and directors, which is a huge shift.
It is. And the velocity of all these new frameworks is causing widespread panic. I mean, if you were an executive or an IT director...
compliance officer.
Exactly. If you are feeling entirely overwhelmed by the sheer volume of these new mandates, that reaction is completely rational.
Because the EU alone is rolling out regulations that alter, well, almost everything. How businesses report environmental impact, how they buy software, how they use artificial intelligence.
And how they monitor supply chains halfway across the world. But when we zoom out and look at the underlying architecture of this whole landscape, there is a clear logic.
A deliberate mechanism, really.
Yes. Regulators are systematically dismantling the defense of paper compliance. And once you understand how they are dismantling it, the individual acronyms start making a lot more sense.
So let's start by establishing the foundational concepts, because our sources highlight a massive amount of confusion between two terms that people throw around interchangeably.
Governance and compliance.
Yes. People treat them like synonyms, but they represent entirely different operational realities. And the source material has this brilliant analogy comparing a corporation to a building.
I love this analogy.
Right. So if we look at governance, it is the architecture of the house. It is the structural blueprint.
It determines where the load-bearing walls go, how power is distributed, who holds the ultimate decision-making authority.
Exactly. It is the formal reporting lines, the structural integrity of the entire company.
So governance is the design. It is the theoretical framework that dictates how things should operate in a perfect world.
But compliance is different.
Very different. Compliance is the safety inspection of that building. It is the gritty, on-the-ground operational practice of meeting your obligations.
Whether those are external legal mandates like a city fire code or just internal rules.
Right. If the governance blueprint dictates that a commercial building needs 4 clearly marked fire exits, Compliance is the physical act of walking the floor.
Making sure those exits are actually clear of stacked boxes.
Yes, verifying the doors are unlocked and checking that the exit signs actually have working batteries.
Which brings us to the third piece of this puzzle, which is internal policies.
Right, the bridge between the two.
Because if governance is the blueprint and compliance is the inspection, then internal policies are essentially the house rules posted on the wall.
They are the translation layer.
Right.
Like an external regulation might be this massive 500-page parliamentary act regarding workplace safety.
Nobody's reading that on the warehouse floor.
Exactly. The internal policy is the bridge that translates that massive legal text into a single, comprehensible directive.
Like a mandate requiring everyone on the floor to wear steel-toed boots.
Precisely. And that translation layer is exactly where the modern corporate crisis actually begins. This is where paper compliance fails.
Because you can have the best blueprint in the world, right?
I can point to dozens of companies over the last 10 years that possessed utterly flawless governance on paper. I mean, their organizational charts were practically a work of art.
Just beautifully structured.
Perfectly structured board committees, meticulously designed risk frameworks, binders upon binders of internal policies. The blueprint was pristine.
And yet, those same companies failed spectacularly.
Catastrophically.
Because having a blueprint of a fire exit does not stop a fire if the door is bolted shut in reality.
That is exactly it.
When we look at the historical failures cited in the research, things like the Volkswagen emissions scandal, the total collapse of Wirecard in 2020.
The cascading risk failures at Credit Suisse.
Right. The pattern is identical every single time. In every one of those catastrophes, the companies had massive compliance departments.
They employed hundreds of risk officers. They spent tens of millions of dollars on legal advice. They had every internal policy you could possibly draft.
The paperwork was all there, so what actually failed?
What failed was the culture. Compliance is not a static document living on a shared corporate intranet drive that nobody looks at.
Right.
It is the aggregate result of thousands of employees making micro decisions every single day under intense pressure.
Take Volkswagen as an example from the sources. The engineering teams had policies dictating environmental standards.
But the lived culture, the actual tangible pressure from management to deliver a diesel engine that could pass U.S. emissions tests without sacrificing performance or cost, that overrode the paper policy.
Employees literally wrote code to cheat the emissions testing.
Because the cultural mandate was make it happen, regardless of the compliance binder sitting on the shelf collecting dust.
Which raises a really difficult question about the very nature of corporate control.
Oh, absolutely.
I mean, if massive global corporations, these entities with practically infinite legal budgets and armies of internal auditors, if they still experience these catastrophic systemic failures...
Does it prove that compliance culture is just a corporate myth?
Exactly. Are we just pretending we can neatly engineer human behavior through policies? Or are regulators fundamentally changing how they measure a company's adherence to the rules?
It is entirely the latter. Regulators have undergone a massive philosophical shift in the last decade.
How so?
Well, historically, a financial regulator or data protection authority might walk into a firm, ask to see the compliance manual, verify that an anti-bribery policy existed.
Check if it was signed by the board.
Right, and essentially give the company a passing grade. They were just inspecting the theoretical blueprint.
Which we know now doesn't work.
Today, regulatory bodies know that the blueprint is practically meaningless as an indicator of real risk. They no longer look at the binder.
What do they look at then?
They specifically target the gap. They measure the distance between what a company's internal policy binder claims and what the employees are actually doing in the field on a random Tuesday afternoon.
They are hunting for the policy to practice gap. This is a critical concept in our sources.
It is the whole ballgame.
And to understand how regulators find this gap, we have to look at the internal policy ecosystem, which the sources describe as a strict hierarchy.
Yes, it is a specific cascade of rules. At the very top, you have the code of conduct,
Which is usually this overarching, somewhat philosophical statement of the company's values, the ethical baseline.
Right. And below that, you have specific policies, which address distinct regulatory risks. So an anti-bribery policy, a GDPR data handling policy, a whistleblower protection policy.
And then below the policies, we get into the operational weeds.
Exactly. That is where you have procedures. These are the granular step-by-step instructions for how an employee actually executes the mandate of the policy.
And at the very foundational base of this whole pyramid,
You have controls. Controls are the physical or digital mechanisms that actually enforce the procedures and prevent deviations.
Okay, let's put that into a really concrete scenario so you can visualize it. Let's say the code of conduct states, we do not engage in corruption or bribery.
A standard, high-level statement.
Right. Then the specific policy states, employees cannot accept gifts from vendors exceeding $50.
Moving from the philosophical to the specific.
Exactly. Then the procedure states, if an employee receives a gift valued at $40, they must log the item, the vendor's name, and the date into this centralized compliance software.
And the control is the software itself. It's programmed to flag or hard block any entry where the declared value exceeds that $50 limit.
Now, that entire cascade is theoretically overseen by what the industry calls the 3 lines of defense model.
Which is a very common structure. The first line of defense is the business operations themselves. The regional sales managers, the traders, the software engineers.
The people who actually own the risk on a daily basis.
Exactly. The second line is the risk and compliance function, which sits independently, setting the frameworks and monitoring the first line.
And the third line?
That is internal audit. They report directly to the board and provide independent assurance that the first 2 lines are functioning correctly.
Now, on a whiteboard, that looks like an impenetrable fortress, right? 3 distinct, separate layers of accountability.
But the research points out that this structure routinely breaks down when the lines collapse into each other.
How does that happen in practice?
Well, imagine a mid-level compliance officer in the second line. If they report to the same regional vice president whose aggressive sales targets are creating the compliance risk in the first place.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, that second line of defense is completely neutralized. The compliance officer's bonus, their performance review, their whole career trajectory.
It's all controlled by the person they are supposed to be policing.
Exactly. Independence just vanishes.
And when independence vanishes, the controls are bypassed, and that policy to practice gap rips wide open.
And this is precisely where modern enforcement actions begin. When a regulator steps in to conduct a gap analysis, they were not initially auditing the firm against the external letter of the law.
Wait, really? They don't start with the law?
No, they start with you. They audit the firm's actual practices against the firm's own internal policies.
Our sources provide a highly specific example of this dynamic that I want to unpack. Let's say a company has this robust, beautifully written internal anti-corruption policy.
Old standard document.
Right, and it clearly states all client hospitality and gifts must be pre-approved by a regional manager. So a regulator comes in.
And they completely ignore that pristine policy binder.
Exactly. Instead, they pull the last 3 years of expense reports, and they discover this systemic pattern where sales employees are routinely taking clients to lavish dinners, self-approving the expenses, and the finance team is just rubber stamping the reimbursements without any managerial sign-off.
And here is the kicker. Even if the regulator cannot prove that a single one of those dinners resulted in an actual bribe or an illegal quid pro quo,
the firm is still facing massive liability.
Massive. Because by failing to enforce their own stated procedure, the company has provided documentary evidence that their governance structure is a complete facade.
They have essentially handed the regulator proof that their internal controls are functionally broken.
Exactly. The gap itself constitutes the regulatory violation. Once a regulator finds that thread of operational inconsistency, they will just keep pulling it until the entire organizational structure unravels.
Which highlights this profound tension that, frankly, anyone working in corporate management knows intimately. It is the conflict between legal precision and operational accessibility.
It is an impossible needle to thread sometimes.
It really is. A corporate policy typically needs to satisfy a highly technical external regulator. It needs to be written with enough bulletproof legal caveats to hold up as a defense in a court of law.
But simultaneously, it must be perfectly understood, internalized, and executed by a tired, stressed-out logistics manager at 4:30 p.m. on a Friday.
Exactly. A 60-page legal treatise on data privacy, drafted by outside counsel to protect the firm in litigation, is functionally useless to a marketing associate who just needs to know if they can legally hit send on a promotional email campaign.
You are describing the fundamental failure of traditional compliance design. If an employee cannot understand the policy without a law degree, they are not going to follow it.
They will just default to whatever action is fastest and most convenient.
Exactly. And the realization that legalese does not drive human behavior is why the most advanced compliance departments are completely changing their hiring practices.
They aren't just hiring former prosecutors and regulatory lawyers anymore, are they?
No, they are actively hiring behavioral scientists, psychologists, and user experience designers.
Oh, wow. UX designers for compliance.
Yes. The goal is to design compliance architecture for the way human beings actually behave under acute commercial pressure, rather than the way lawyers wish they behaved in a theoretical vacuum.
That is fascinating. But managing this internal complexity is hard enough on its own. Now, companies have to map all of these behavioral house rules against the most ambitious, comprehensive set of external regulations ever produced.
The European Union has essentially rewritten the rulebook for global commerce.
Let's talk about the post-2020 EU regulatory rollout, because the sources call it a massive paradigm shift.
It is. We are looking at major legislative instruments that systematically redraw the boundaries of what a corporation is responsible for. But before we get into the specifics of the directives, the most vital concept to grasp is the architecture.
Right, they are not just isolated rules.
Exactly. These regulations are not operating in silos. They are designed as a deeply interconnected, interlocking system. A failure in one domain almost inevitably trips an enforcement wire in another.
Okay, let's break down this alphabet soup, starting with the directive that has sustainability and finance departments sweating bullets right now.
The CSRD.
The Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive.
Right. The phased rollout began in 2024, and it is going to eventually capture over 50,000 companies. To understand why this is so disruptive, we have to look at what ESG reporting used to be.
Which was largely a voluntary marketing exercise.
Completely. Companies would publish a glossy annual sustainability report, feature a nice photo of a solar panel.
Talk in very vague terms about their commitment to the community. It was essentially corporate public relations. The previous framework allowed companies massive leeway in what they reported and how they measured it.
The CSRD obliterates that era of voluntary bespoke reporting. It mandates highly standardized, rigorously audited disclosures covering an organization's entire environmental and social footprint.
We are talking granular metrics. Greenhouse gas emissions, biodiversity impact, water consumption, treatment of direct workers, impacts on local communities.
And all of this must be reported using a strict, uniform taxonomy known as the European Sustainability Reporting Standards.
And the core concept driving the CSRD, which our sources emphasize heavily, is something called double materiality.
This is a fascinating mechanism because it entirely reverses the traditional lens of financial reporting.
Unpack that for us. What does that mean?
Well, historically, financial reporting has been obsessed with single materiality. The only question a CFO had to answer was, how does the external world affect our profitability?
Right, so if shifting weather patterns threaten to flood our primary manufacturing facility, how much shareholder value is at risk?
Exactly. But double materiality forces the company to answer a second, equally binding question. How do our operations affect the external world?
So it flows in both directions.
Yes. It fundamentally alters the definition of corporate risk. Under double materiality, a company must assess and legally disclose those outward impacts.
So it is no longer just about assessing whether a regional water shortage will halt your beverage production line.
No. You must now quantify and disclose whether your beverage plant's water extraction is exacerbating the drought for the surrounding agricultural community.
Wow, so they're forcing companies to assign hard, auditable data to their externalized costs.
Exactly. The EU is turning sustainability from a soft PR narrative into a rigid, auditable pillar of corporate governance. If a company fabricates its water usage data under CSRD, it is no different than fabricating top-line revenue on a financial statement.
That is a massive shift. So while the CSRD forces companies to map their physical and environmental footprint, the EU is also building this huge regulatory fence around the digital frontier.
Which is evolving at an even faster pace.
Which brings us to the AI Act, becoming fully enforceable in August 2026. This is the world's first comprehensive legal framework for artificial intelligence.
And it utilizes a strict risk-based classification system. It categorizes AI systems into 4 tiers: unacceptable risk, high risk, limited risk, and minimal risk.
And the categorization dictates the compliance burden, right?
Yes. Systems deemed an unacceptable risk, such as real-time biometric categorization by law enforcement in public spaces or social scoring systems, are banned outright.
But the vast majority of corporate anxiety is centered on the high-risk category.
Absolutely. This encompasses AI tools used in critical infrastructure, medical devices, educational access, and crucially for most businesses, employment and financial services.
So if you are using an AI system to sort through job applications or to determine an individual's creditworthiness for a mortgage,
You are operating a high-risk system.
and the compliance requirements for high-risk AI are incredibly steep. Continuous human oversight, high-quality training data governance, logging of activity, and mandatory registration in a public EU database.
And the penalties for getting this wrong are existential. We are
Huh.
talking fines up to 35 million euros or 7% of a company's total global annual turnover, whichever is higher.
7% of global turnover is insane. Here's where I want to push back and explore a practical hypothetical because the liability structure seems really complex. Let's use the analogy of hiring a chauffeur.
Okay, I'm following.
If I hire a driver, I don't need to know how to build the car's engine. But if I order that driver to speed through a school zone, I cannot blame the car manufacturer when an accident happens.
Right.
Apply that to the AI Act. If I run a mid-sized regional bank, I likely do not have a team of machine learning engineers building proprietary AI models from scratch.
No, you'd buy it off the shelf.
Exactly. I am going to buy a third-party AI software from a major tech vendor to help my HR department screen resumes. Since I didn't build the algorithm, does the liability and the threat of that 35 million euro fine stay with the tech company that coded it?
That is the assumption most executives make, and it is entirely incorrect. The AI Act places an immense legal burden on the deployers of the system, not just the developers.
So the bank is on the hook.
Yes. If your regional bank purchases that resume screening software, you are the deployer of a high-risk AI system. You cannot simply outsource your liability to the vendor through a software-as-a-service contract.
So if that AI tool develops a discriminatory bias, say it learns to downgrade candidates from a specific zip code that indirectly proxies for race or socioeconomic status.
The regulatory hammer falls heavily on the bank. You are required to implement human oversight to catch that bias. You must monitor the system's outputs within your specific operational environment.
That completely shatters the traditional, it's just a vendor software subscription mindset. You are adopting the risk of the intelligence you integrate.
You are. And this theme of preventing companies from outsourcing their accountability leads directly into the next major pillar of the EU framework, DORA.
The Digital Operational Resilience Act, taking effect in January 2025.
Right. DORA is designed to address a massive systemic vulnerability in the global financial sector: cloud concentration risk.
Which is the fact that everyone uses the same 3 cloud providers.
Exactly. Over the last decade, banks, insurance companies, investment firms have aggressively migrated their core infrastructure to AWS, Microsoft Azure, and Google Cloud.
And historically, a financial institution's attitude toward a cloud outage or a hack was just to point fingers at the vendor. It's not our fault our cloud went down.
DORA explicitly outlaws that defense. It mandates that financial entities must maintain strict oversight, continuous testing, and active management of their third-party IT providers.
So if a regional European bank relies entirely on a major U.S. cloud provider, and that provider suffers a catastrophic cyber attack taking the bank offline for 48 hours,
DORA dictates that the bank itself is held accountable for the disruption to the financial system. The bank's board must prove they had contingency plans, exit strategies, and continuous risk assessments of that vendor.
the perimeter of what a company is responsible for controlling has just fundamentally expanded.
Massively expanded. And that expansion is even more pronounced in the CS3D.
The Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, adopted in 2024. While DORA expands accountability into the digital supply chain, CS3D expands it deep into the physical global supply chain.
CS3D is arguably the most complex logistical challenge in the entire EU framework. It mandates that large companies conduct rigorous due diligence to identify, prevent, mitigate, and account for adverse human rights and environmental impacts throughout their entire value chain.
Let's look at the apparel industry as an example. Imagine a massive European fast fashion retailer.
Their corporate headquarters in Paris or Milan might be pristine. They might have incredible labor standards for their direct employees.
But they source their cotton and manufacture their garments in factories across Southeast Asia. Under older, softer regulatory regimes, if an investigative journalist uncovered horrific working conditions or severe toxic runoff at a subcontractor's factory in Bangladesh,
It was a massive public relations disaster for the European brand, sure. But from a strict legal liability standpoint, It was an arm's-length transaction.
The brand could legally claim they are an independent third-party supplier operating in a different jurisdiction we didn't know.
CS3D removes that legal shield entirely. It creates a direct chain of civil liability. That European retailer is now legally obligated to map and monitor not just their direct Tier 1 suppliers, but their suppliers deep into the value chain.
They must integrate human rights and environmental clauses into their contracts.
And critically, they must verify compliance. If a factory in Bangladesh is utilizing forced labor or illegally dumping chemical dyes into a local river, the European parent company can be sued for civil damages directly in European courts by the affected workers or communities.
Provided the company failed to conduct adequate due diligence to prevent the harm. But the mechanical difficulty of actually executing that due diligence is staggering.
Oh, it's a nightmare. How does a corporate compliance officer in Germany ensure that a sub-tier supplier in a different hemisphere isn't simply falsifying their labor logs before the auditor arrives?
It requires an entirely new level of supply chain visibility that most companies just do not have right now.
Exactly.
Rounding out the major pillars of our sources, we have the foundational data and financial frameworks, GDPR, dealing with data protection, and the sixth anti-money laundering directive, or 6-AMLD.
And GDPR really functioned as the aggressive template for this whole new era of EU regulation. It normalized the concept of extraterritorial reach and those astronomical fines based on global turnover.
Right, and 6-AMLD focuses on harmonizing the definition of money laundering offenses across all EU member states, expanding criminal liability.
Making it significantly harder for illicit funds to exploit jurisdictional loopholes. But when you look at all 5 of these frameworks, CSRD, the AI Act, DORA, CS3D, and the Data AML directives, the true danger for a corporation lies in their intersection.
The cascading failure.
Yes. If your company suffers a massive customer data breach because you fail to properly vet the cybersecurity standards of a third-party cloud vendor.
You are not just facing a massive GDPR fine for losing the data.
No, you have simultaneously triggered a DORA violation for failing to manage your third-party IT risk.
And if that breached data is subsequently weaponized by bad actors to circumvent identity verification and launder funds, you are potentially looking at a 6-AMLD investigation.
Regulators no longer look at a single broken rule. They look at the entire systemic collapse of your governance architecture.
If you are a chief information officer or a head of supply chain listening to this, the sheer operational burden of mapping these interconnected liabilities is it's daunting.
It really is.
But the critical question our sources force us to ask is, when a company inevitably fails to navigate this labyrinth, who actually takes the fall?
And that is the million-dollar question. Because the historical precedent of a corporation paying a large fine out of a legal slush fund, issuing an apology press release, and moving on.
That era is closing rapidly.
We are squarely in the era of personal accountability. Regulators have studied corporate behavior over the last 2 decades and concluded that penalizing the abstract corporate entity is highly inefficient.
Because massive multinational corporations often treat regulatory fines as just a standard cost of doing business.
Exactly. If a financial institution generates €1 billion in revenue through a highly aggressive, non-compliant trading strategy and eventually gets hit with a €200 million regulatory fine 5 years later.
The math still works in their favor. It was a highly profitable risk.
Right. To actually alter corporate behavior, regulators must change the calculus for the individuals making the decisions. They are actively targeting executives, senior managers, and board members.
And the sources trace a significant portion of this philosophical shift back to the United Kingdom, specifically the Senior Managers and Certification Regime, or SMCR.
Yes, which was implemented in the wake of the 2008 financial crisis.
Which makes sense, given the fallout.
The UK's SMCR was a watershed moment in regulatory enforcement. It was designed specifically to eliminate the diffusion of responsibility that occurs in massive bureaucracies.
Where every executive points the finger at someone else when a crisis hits.
Exactly. SMCR forces highly specific mapping of responsibilities. A senior executive must formally sign a document taking personal, individual responsibility for the compliance of a very specific business unit or function.
So if that business unit engages in market manipulation or systemic compliance failures,
the regulator does not simply fine the bank. They go directly after the designated senior manager. They can levy devastating personal fines, and they can permanently revoke the individual's license to work in the financial sector.
And the EU has heavily integrated the spirit of that regime into its new directives. We're witnessing a fundamental evolution in the legal standard applied to corporate leadership.
We really are.
Can you walk us through the mechanics of that shift? How is the legal standard used to judge a board of directors changing in real time?
Well, the legal standard is aggressively shifting from a documentary review to a behavioral review. 10 years ago, if a major compliance failure occurred, the board of directors was generally insulated from personal liability if they could just point to a documentary trail.
The defense was, we hired a chief compliance officer, we approved a robust anti-money laundering policy, and we allocated budget to the department. We did our structural duty.
Today, that documentary defense is entirely insufficient. Regulators are interrogating the board's actual behavior.
What does that look like?
The standard is now. Did the board exercise reasonable skill, care, and diligence in actively overseeing that policy? Did they ask adversarial, challenging questions of the executive team?
So when the chief risk officer presented a dashboard showing an anomalous spike in high-risk transactions in a specific emerging market, did the board demand an independent investigation?
Exactly. Or did they accept a superficial reassurance from the CEO and look the other way because revenues were up?
This behavioral standard is deeply intertwined with the new EU whistleblowing directive, too.
Oh, absolutely. The directive mandates that organizations with 50 or more employees must establish highly secure, confidential internal reporting channels, and it explicitly outlaws any form of retaliation against the whistleblower.
But simply setting up an encrypted email inbox is just the procedural requirement, right?
Right. The governance challenge is proving that the intelligence generated by those whistleblowers actually escalates to the board level, and that the board has a documented mechanism for acting on that intelligence without executive interference.
Now, to truly understand why regulators have become so obsessed with individual accountability and active board oversight, we have to examine the anatomy of a catastrophic failure.
And there was no better example than Wirecard.
The source material provides an extensive deep dive into the 2020 collapse of Wirecard in Germany. This wasn't just a compliance hiccup. This was a multi-billion-euro fraud that shook the foundation of the European financial establishment.
Wirecard was a darling of the European tech scene, a massive payments processor that was heralded as the future of fintech.
And then 1.9 billion euros simply evaporated. How does a fraud of that magnitude survive for years under the collective noses of global auditors and national regulators?
Wirecard is the definitive case study in systemic governance failure, and its shadow looms over every single piece of new EU regulation we have discussed today.
Break it down for us.
Wirecard presented itself as a highly profitable digital payments giant, processing transactions all over the globe. A massive portion of their claimed profit and cash reserves supposedly resided in external, third-party acquiring businesses, primarily located in Asia.
Right. The company's balance sheet claimed that 1.9 billion euros of corporate cash was sitting in trustee accounts in the Philippines.
But it was a complete fabrication. The money simply did not exist.
But a fraud that massive requires an ecosystem of enablers. You can't just fake nearly 2 billion euros in a highly regulated public market without someone noticing the discrepancies.
And many people did notice. This was not a sophisticated, invisible crime that suddenly revealed itself overnight. The smoke had been billowing for years.
Who is ringing the alarm bells?
Dan McCrum, an investigative journalist at the Financial Times, alongside a team of reporters, spent years meticulously documenting and publishing articles regarding deeply suspicious accounting practices, fake offices, and phantom partners associated with Wirecard.
Short sellers in the financial markets were actively betting against the company too, screaming from the rooftops that the cash flow models made no mathematical sense.
And crucially, there were internal whistleblowers within Wirecard's own ranks who attempted to alert management and external auditors about the systemic forgery.
So the intelligence was widespread, the red flags were practically neon. So how did every single line of defense fail?
Let's look at the architecture of the company. The internal governance was a hollow shell. The executive team was operating what amounted to a cult of personality, characterized by aggressive intimidation.
And the supervisory board.
The supervisory board, whose explicit legal duty was to challenge the executive team and protect shareholders, utterly failed to exercise independent oversight. They just accepted the CEO's narratives without independently verifying the crisis.
And what about the external auditors?
The external failure was even more severe. The global auditing firm tasked with signing off on Wirecard's financials routinely certified the accounts year after year, fundamentally failing to execute basic auditing procedures.
Like demanding direct independent confirmation from the banks in the Philippines that the 1.9 billion euros actually existed.
Exactly. Instead, they just accepted documents provided by Wirecard executives.
But the most shocking failure in the entire Wirecard saga belongs to the German financial regulator, BaFin.
Oh, this part is just mind-blowing.
Their mandate was to protect the integrity of the market. But when presented with mounting evidence of massive fraud from investigative journalists, BaFin didn't launch a raid on Wirecard's headquarters.
Instead, they effectively acted as Wirecard's defense mechanism. They launched investigations into the short sellers.
And incredibly, BaFin actually filed criminal complaints against the Financial Times journalists who were trying to expose the fraud, accusing them of market manipulation.
Furthermore, it was later revealed that employees within the regulatory agency itself were actively trading Wirecard stock while the agency was supposed to be investigating the company.
It was an absolute devastating collapse of institutional trust.
When the fraud finally became undeniable and Wirecard collapsed into insolvency in June 2020, the economic and reputational damage to the German financial sector was incalculable.
You have to view the current wave of EU regulation through the lens of that specific trauma. The push for enhanced liability for external auditors, the aggressive structural overhaul of national financial regulators, and the relentless focus on making board members personally liable if they ignore whistleblowers.
All of this is a direct, visceral reaction to the humiliation of the Wirecard scandal.
The regulatory takeaway from Wirecard is clear. I didn't know is no longer a valid legal defense.
No, in the eyes of modern regulators, ignorance is merely a confession of negligence. If the board didn't know about a massive internal fraud, it is because they failed to construct a governance architecture capable of telling them.
But I have to push back here with a broader philosophical question.
Go for it.
If all of these incredibly dense frameworks, the CSRD, DORA, the new auditor liabilities, are fundamentally reactions to past traumas like the 2008 financial crisis or the 2020 Wirecard collapse, aren't we structurally driving while looking in the rearview mirror?
What do you mean?
Well, we are meticulously engineering rules to prevent a fraud based on fake Asian escrow accounts. But the financial world has moved on to decentralized finance, generative AI, and quantum encryption. Are we spending billions of euros regulating the exact shape of the last crisis while remaining entirely blind to the shape of the next one?
That is the perpetual vulnerability of the regulatory state. Regulation, by its very nature, is reactionary. The legislative process is slow, and it requires a tangible disaster to generate the political will necessary to pass massive reform.
You cannot draft a hyper-specific law to prevent a disaster that hasn't been invented yet.
Exactly. The frameworks we are rolling out in 2024 and 2025 are essentially sophisticated bandages applied to the structural wounds exposed over the last 10 years.
Which means the next Wirecard or the next massive corporate failure won't look anything like Wirecard. It will exploit a technological or financial loophole that the current frameworks haven't even conceptualized.
Precisely. And this is why relying entirely on external regulatory compliance to protect your organization is a failing strategy. If your only goal is to tick the boxes of the CSRD or the AI Act, you are only protected against yesterday's threats.
So how do you protect against tomorrow's threats?
To actually survive the velocity of modern business, to navigate risks that haven't been named yet, a company needs an internal culture that functions as a highly sensitive early warning system. You need an organizational culture capable of detecting ethical rot, systemic risk, and operational failure long before that failure ever breaches the text of an EU directive.
This brings us to the most practical, actionable insight from our sources, the architecture of a compliance culture that actually works in reality, not just on paper. This is the antidote to the rearview mirror problem.
Yes, our sources identify 5 essential sequential steps to building an organization that can survive this new era of enforcement.
Let's dive into step 1, tone from the top. And the crucial distinction here is that tone means observable behavior, not corporate messaging. Every Fortune 500 CEO has stood on a stage and declared, integrity is our core value.
That statement is entirely costless. True tone from the top is defined exclusively by what leadership does when maintaining integrity negatively impacts short-term revenue.
Give me an example of that test.
The classic test happens on the sales floor. Imagine a scenario where a company's highest-performing regional sales director, a person responsible for 20% of the firm's quarterly revenue, is caught repeatedly violating a critical safety protocol or bypassing anti-bribery controls to close deals.
Does executive leadership terminate that top performer?
Exactly. If they issue a quiet warning and allow the behavior to continue because they desperately need the revenue to hit quarterly targets, the true tone of the organization is broadcast instantly to every single employee. Profits supersede rules.
Employees do not read the code of conduct, they read the incentive structure and the behavior of the executives, which leads perfectly into step 2, human policies. We discussed earlier how legalistic 60-page PDF documents fail to drive behavior. Building a real culture requires translating those mandates into scenario-based, visceral guidance that employees can instantly relate to.
You have to abandon the annual click-through slideshows where employees just hit next until they get a certificate. Human policies provide context and friction.
So instead of a blanket statement like, do not violate the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act.
A human policy gives a specific scenario. It says, you are an operations manager trying to clear a shipment of vital components through customs in a foreign port. A local official informs you that your paperwork is delayed, but implies the process can be expedited if you pay a $500 processing fee in cash to a specific third-party vendor. What are your immediate next steps?
You have to train employees on the exact anatomy of the dilemmas they will actually face in their specific roles.
Exactly.
Step 3 is perhaps the most fragile mechanism in the entire governance structure, closing the feedback loop. This directly addresses the whistleblowing directive we discussed.
Yes. If an employee observes systemic fraud, stepping forward is an act of massive personal and professional risk. If they report that concern through the proper channels and then hear absolutely nothing back, no acknowledgement, no update on an investigation, no visible change in operations, that employee will never report an issue again.
And the damage compounds, doesn't it?
Massively. That employee will tell their colleagues that the whistleblowing hotline is a black hole designed to protect management. Once that narrative takes hold, your internal intelligence network dries up instantaneously.
The board goes entirely blind.
Right. A functioning culture requires a rigid protocol for communicating back to the reporter within legal constraints, demonstrating that the organization took the intelligence seriously, investigated it thoroughly, and implemented corrective action. You have to prove to the workforce that the system is not a sham.
Step 4 is integration into business processes. This is the shift from treating compliance as an external checkpoint to embedding it in the foundational design. It is the concept of ethics by design.
The traditional model of compliance is the speed bump approach. A product team spends 18 months developing a new digital service, and 2 weeks before the launch date, they hand it over to the legal and compliance team for review.
Compliance spots a massive GDPR violation, halts the launch, and is immediately viewed as the enemy of innovation.
Integration means the compliance officer is sitting at the table during the initial brainstorming session. If you are developing an AI tool, the data privacy constraints must dictate the architecture of the code from day one, not act as a patch applied at the end.
And finally, step 5, which our sources identify as the absolute bedrock of modern governance. Tolerance for challenge, widely known as psychological safety. This is the ultimate test of the house architecture.
If a junior financial analyst identifies a massive miscalculation in the risk model for a multi-million-dollar merger, do they feel professionally safe walking into a senior partner's office and pointing out the error?
If the answer to that question is no, if the junior analyst fears retaliation, ridicule, or career stagnation for speaking up, then your entire multi-million-dollar governance structure is fundamentally broken.
It does not matter how many lines of defense you have, if the people manning those lines are terrified to fire a warning flare.
What I find truly fascinating is that this isn't just HR theory anymore. Regulators are actively quantifying and auditing psychological safety. The sources note that bodies like the Financial Conduct Authority in the UK and the European Banking Authority are utilizing behavioral science metrics to audit corporate culture.
They aren't just reading policies, they are analyzing the data exhaust of the workforce.
But how exactly does a regulator mathematically measure a culture of fear?
They look for behavioral anomalies that contradict the company's stated narrative. A prime metric is the turnover rate within the second line of defense.
Like the compliance officers?
Right. If a major bank cycles through 3 chief risk officers or chief compliance officers in a span of 36 months, regulators view that as a massive screaming red flag. It suggests that anyone who tries to enforce the rules is systematically forced out by the executive team.
They also deeply analyze the reporting volume on whistleblowing hotlines, right?
Yes. Paradoxically, if a company with 15,000 employees claims to have a world-class, deeply ethical culture, and points to the fact that their internal reporting hotline has received exactly 0 complaints in 2 years, regulators do not view that as a clean bill of health.
Because in a population of 15,000 human beings, ethical lapses, interpersonal conflicts, and procedural errors are a statistical certainty.
Exactly. If the hotline is silent, it is not because the company is perfect. It is because the culture is gripped by a catastrophic lack of psychological safety. Silence is the loudest indicator of systemic risk.
Let's ground all of this behavioral theory in the harshest reality of corporate life. Picture a regional sales desk at the end of the third quarter. The broader macroeconomic environment is brutal. The team is missing their targets.
I can picture it vividly.
The regional director knows that if they don't close a specific set of aggressive, borderline non-compliant deals by Friday, the entire team loses their quarterly bonuses and he might lose his job. How do you practically maintain ethics by design and psychological safety when the adrenaline of the deadline, the pressure from shareholders, and the literal financial incentives of the employees are all screaming at them to cut corners?
How does a compliance officer fight the overwhelming gravity of a compensation structure?
Exactly.
That scenario is the crucible, the hardest, most persistent challenge in corporate governance. The brutal truth is that you cannot fight a financial incentive with a moral argument.
Right.
If a salesperson's compensation and career advancement are tied 100% to top-line revenue generation and 0% to compliance metrics, human nature dictates they will optimize entirely for revenue.
So what is the structural solution?
The only structural way to counteract the overwhelming temptation of short-term financial targets is to ensure the incentive structure aligns with the governance structure. You have to make the long-term financial consequences of bad governance devastatingly clear and deeply personal to the individuals driving the revenue.
This means implementing rigorous clawback provisions.
Yes. If an aggressive deal closed in Q3 is later found to have violated anti-bribery statutes, the bonuses of the sales team, the regional director, and the executives overseeing that division must be clawed back. When compliance metrics dictate the payout of the bonus pool, suddenly, ethics by design ceases to be an abstract HR concept and becomes an urgent, practical priority for the sales director.
Which brings us to the final, most persuasive argument for taking all of this seriously: the true financial cost and the hidden return on investment of robust governance. Let's talk numbers, because financial impact is the universal language of the boardroom.
The sheer scale of the regulatory fines being levied under these new frameworks is designed to alter corporate DNA. The era of the slap-on-the-wrist fine is over.
If we look at GDPR enforcement as the leading indicator, regulators across Europe have issued over 4 billion euros in fines since the regulation gained teeth.
That includes a single jaw-dropping fine of 1.2 billion euros levied against Meta by the Irish Data Protection Commission regarding the unlawful transfer of European user data to the United States. One company, one specific data governance failure, over €1 billion.
And the frameworks coming online now carry even heavier artillery. The AI Act threatens penalties of up to 35 million euros or 7% of global annual turnover. For a major multinational tech conglomerate, 7% of global turnover isn't a fine. It's a decapitation strike that could wipe out tens of billions of dollars in shareholder value.
But our sources make a vital point here. The headline regulatory fine is almost always just the tip of the spear. The hidden systemic costs of governance failure are exponentially larger.
Let's go back to the Volkswagen emissions scandal. The direct regulatory fines issued by environmental agencies were massive, yes, but they represented a fraction of the total economic carnage.
Right. When the systemic cultural failure of their engineering governance was exposed, the secondary costs exploded. Volkswagen faced tens of billions in civil class action litigation from consumers. They had to execute massive financial settlements with their own furious dealership networks.
They experienced a catastrophic collapse in their global stock price, incinerating shareholder wealth.
And they suffered brand contamination that made their products radioactive to environmentally conscious consumers for a decade. The total estimated cost of the scandal exceeded 35 billion euros. The regulatory fine was just the admission ticket to a decade of systemic financial pain.
The punitive stick is terrifying. But let's look at the other side of the ledger. Historically, the C-suite has viewed the compliance department purely as a cost center, a necessary evil, a department of no that drains budget, slows down innovation, and generates zero revenue.
Our sources argue that this perspective is dangerously outdated. Strong compliance and robust governance architecture are increasingly recognized as a critical investment.
Let's outline the actual ROI of good governance.
This is the strategic shift that forward-thinking boards are currently executing. Institutional capital has fundamentally altered its risk models. Major asset managers, pension funds, and private equity firms are deeply integrating ESG ratings, CSRD disclosures, and detailed governance audits into their capital allocation decisions.
They understand that a company with a chaotic, paper-thin compliance culture is a ticking time bomb.
Conversely, a company that can prove it has a highly integrated, psychologically safe governance structure is mathematically a safer long-term bet.
And a safer bet directly translates into cheaper capital.
Exactly. Companies with provably strong governance structures secure better interest rates on corporate debt issuance. They negotiate significantly lower premiums for directors' and officers' liability insurance, precisely because the insurer assesses the risk of a catastrophic executive failure to be lower.
Furthermore, robust governance provides actual, quantifiable legal armor. Regulators operate with limited resources.
Right. If a company discovers a data breach, proactively self-reports it to the Data Protection Authority and can hand over documentation proving they had a sophisticated, heavily funded compliance culture that simply failed against a novel threat, regulators are explicitly authorized, and frequently choose, to drastically reduce the punitive fines. The investment in the compliance culture literally pays dividends in the form of regulatory leniency.
If we tie this all the way back to the architectural analogy we established at the beginning of our discussion, investing in reinforced load-bearing walls, installing state-of-the-art fire suppression systems, and fostering a culture where every tenant feels obligated to keep the hallways clear, this isn't just about passing a municipal building inspection to avoid a citation.
It fundamentally increases the intrinsic value of the asset.
High-quality tenants demand to lease space in a safe, well-managed building. Institutional investors want to own a resilient asset. Robust governance is not a brake pedal. It is the structural integrity that allows a company to drive faster without tearing itself apart.
That is the ultimate realization. It is value creation achieved through rigorous systemic risk mitigation.
We have covered a tremendous expanse of regulatory and operational territory today. Let's synthesize the massive amount of source material into 3 definitive takeaways.
Number one, the new European Union regulatory framework encompassing the CSRD, the AI Act, DORA, and CS3D must be understood as an overlapping, interconnected digital and physical ecosystem. You cannot manage these risks in isolated departmental silos.
Right. A failure in vendor management under DORA will metastasize into a data failure under GDPR. The liabilities bleed across every operational boundary.
Number two, the distance between your beautifully drafted corporate policy and the actual daily behavior of your employees is where all modern legal liability resides. Regulators have stopped reading the blueprint. They are actively auditing your culture, measuring psychological safety, and hunting for the policy-to-practice gap.
And number 3, the era of the corporate shield is fracturing. Compliance is no longer a task that can be delegated to a mid-level risk officer.
It is an urgent, board-level imperative,
Hmm.
and personal financial and legal accountability for senior managers is the new global standard. You cannot outsource your legal liability, whether you are buying AI from a tech giant or sourcing materials from a factory across the globe.
I want to leave you with one final, deeply provocative thought to consider. We acknowledged earlier that regulation is inherently backward-looking. We have spent the last hour discussing the massive multi-billion-euro legal architectures being constructed today to prevent the specific scandals of the last decade.
But as the velocity of commerce accelerates into an era dominated by autonomous algorithmic trading, generative AI, and decentralized operational structures, the next catastrophic corporate failure will not be a replica of Wirecard or a repeat of the Volkswagen emissions cheat.
The next crisis will emerge from the operational shadows. It will exploit a vulnerability that our current regulatory frameworks haven't even developed the vocabulary to name yet. So, the ultimate question you must ask yourself is this: does your organization possess an internal culture that is sensitive, responsive, and brave enough to detect and halt a totally unprecedented ethical dilemma? Or is your entire governance architecture perfectly engineered to only fight the ghosts of the past?
It is a question every board should be asking themselves right now.
Absolutely. The Diary of a Lawyer and all its content published is strictly for educational and informational purposes only. Nothing presented here constitutes legal, medical, or mental health advice, nor does it create an attorney-client relationship and does not constitute professional advice. Please be sure to consult with a qualified professional in your jurisdiction regarding your personal situation for advice that is tailored to your specific situation. Stay safe and curious out there, and we will see you in the next episode.